They say blood is thicker than water, but in my family, blood was just something my brother was willing to spill to get a bigger paycheck. My name is Cassandra Vance. I'm 34 years old, and for the last decade, I've been a freelance architectural conservator, a fancy way of saying I fix the broken foundations of old, forgotten homes. Ironic, right? Because while I was busy saving everyone else's history, my own brother, Julian, was planning to bulldoze mine. For 34 years, I lived under the suffocating shadow of the Vance family tradition. It's an old-school patriarchal nightmare where the men are kings and the women are just scenery. 3 weeks ago, the world stopped. We buried our parents on a Tuesday. By Thursday, I was standing on the sidewalk of the only home I'd ever known, clutching a single suitcase while Julian smirked at me through the screen door. He didn't even have the decency to wait until the flowers on the graves had wilted. He looked me straight in the eye, adjusted his designer tie, and said, "Cassie, let's be real." Dad's vision was always clear. The empire stays with the heir. A daughter is a liability, not an asset. You've had a free ride for 34 years. Now, you're just trespassing. Then, he did it. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was the loudest thing I've ever heard. He changed the locks on the house where I'd spent 2 grueling years as a full-time nurse for our mother. While Julian was in Dubai closing big deals and posting photos of his gold watch, I was the one changing bandages. I was the one holding Mom's hand at 3 a.m. when the pain got so bad she forgot her own name. Julian visited 3 times in 2 years. Each time, he spent the whole visit checking his phone and complaining that the sick room smell was ruining his expensive suit. As I stood there on the lawn, staring at my childhood belongings scattered in the grass like trash, a neighbor's dog barked in the distance. I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. Julian thought he had won. He thought he'd successfully purged the burden from the family ledger. Hold on. Before we get into the real stuff, I want to know, what are you doing at this exact moment while hearing my voice? I love seeing your answers down below in the comments. Are you at work, folding laundry, or maybe you're like me, waiting for the moment the tables finally turn? Because here is the thing Julian forgot. My mother wasn't just a patient in that bed. She was a strategist. For 8 years, while my father and brother looked right through her, she was working. She saw the way the wind was blowing long before the storm hit. She knew Julian would try to erase me the second the soil hit the casket. What Julian didn't know, what he couldn't possibly fathom, was that Mom had spent nearly a decade building a fortress he couldn't even see. She'd been having secret meetings with a legal firm in a different state. She'd been moving assets, signing papers, and leaving a trail of breadcrumbs that only I could follow. As I picked up my bruised suitcase and walked away from the house, I wasn't crying because I was homeless. I was crying because I knew what was coming for him. The reading of the will was scheduled for Monday morning at 10:01 a.m. Julian thought it was going to be his coronation. He had no idea it was actually going to be his execution. But as I reached the end of the driveway, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. It said, "The safe deposit box is empty. He found it first." My heart dropped into my stomach. Had Julian already outplayed us? The text message stared back at me like a death warrant. "The safe deposit box is empty. He found it first." My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped my phone onto the cold pavement. This was the one thing my mother told me to guard with my life. It wasn't just about the money. That box contained the physical proof of Julian's creative accounting during the years he managed Dad's offshore holdings. It was my only leverage. I looked back at the house, the grand, white-pillared Vance estate. Julian was probably inside right now, pouring himself a glass of Dad's 20-year-old scotch, toasting to his own brilliance. Had he been spying on Mom too? Had he been one step ahead of her for 8 years? I felt a wave of nausea. If Julian had those documents, he wouldn't just kick me out. He'd ensure I was legally silenced forever. But then, I remembered something Mom whispered to me 3 days before she passed. She was drifted in and out of lucidity, her voice a thin rasp. She'd gripped my wrist and said, "Cassie, The fox thinks he knows where the hen hides her eggs, but the hen doesn't keep them in the coop. At the time, I thought it was the morphine talking. Now, standing on the sidewalk with nothing but a suitcase and a looming sense of dread, it clicked. My mother knew Julian. She knew his arrogance was his greatest weakness. He would go for the most obvious target, the local bank where the family had done business for 40 years. He'd use Dad's power of attorney to bully his way into that safe deposit box. I didn't call the unknown number back. Instead, I hailed a cab and gave them an address 3 towns over, a small, dusty town called Oakhaven, where my mother's sister, my Aunt Martha, had lived until she passed away 5 years ago. While the cab sped down the highway, I watched the city skyline fade in the rearview mirror. I thought about the way Julian looked at me when he changed those locks. It wasn't just greed, it was genuine pleasure. He enjoyed the natural order of things. He truly believed that because I was a woman, I was a secondary character in the story of the Vance family. He saw me as a maid who had outlived her usefulness. "You okay back there, miss?" the cab driver asked, catching my eye in the mirror. "I'm fine," I lied, my voice steady, just realizing that some foundations are built on sand. When we arrived in Oakhaven, I went straight to a tiny, independent credit union. It was the kind of place that still used paper ledgers for some things. I walked up to the counter and asked for a box registered under the name The Magnolia Trust. The teller, an older woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose, looked at me for a long beat. "We've been expecting you, Cassandra. Your mother said you'd come when the locks were changed." My heart leaped. When the locks were changed. She knew. She knew exactly how Julian would play his hand. The teller led me to a private room and handed me a heavy metal box. When I opened it, there were no gold bars or stacks of cash. Instead, there was a stack of specialized architectural blueprints and a flash drive labeled The Foundation of the Truth. I plugged the drive into my laptop, and my breath hitched. It wasn't just Julian's fraud records. It was a series of recorded video diaries Mom had made over the last 8 years. I clicked on the most recent one. In the video, Mom looked frail, but her eyes were sharp as flint. "Cassie," she said, "if you're watching this, Julian has already shown his true face. He thinks he's inherited a kingdom. He doesn't realize he's inherited a debt that will bankrupt his soul. Tomorrow is the will reading. He's going to bring his lawyers. He's going to try to humiliate you. Let him. Let him boast. Let him feel like the king of the world. Because the bigger the ego, the harder the crash." She then explained the blueprints. They weren't for the family house. They were for a massive commercial development Julian had been secretly spearheading using borrowed family funds, a project he'd kept hidden from our father. A project that was currently sitting on land my mother had quietly bought out from under him years ago. The empire Julian thought he owned was actually sitting on a plot of land owned entirely by me. But the final file on the drive was the one that made my blood run cold. It was a scanned copy of a second will. A will signed by my father just 48 hours before he died. A will that Julian didn't know existed. The tension in my chest tightened. The will reading was less than 24 hours away. Julian thought he was walking into a coronation, but I was about to walk in with a detonator. As I left the credit union, my phone rang. It was Julian. "Cassie," he drawled, his voice dripping with fake pity. "I hope you found a cheap motel. I'm calling to remind you about the meeting tomorrow. Don't be late. I want you there to witness the official transfer of power. It'll be good for you. Closure, you know." "Oh, I'll be there, Julian," I said, a cold smile spreading across my face. I wouldn't miss it for the world. "Good girl," he said, and hung up. He had no idea. He thought he was the predator, but the trap was already set. However, as I turned the corner toward my hotel, I noticed a black sedan that had been following my cab from the city. It pulled up to the curb, and 2 men in suits stepped out. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The 2 men in suits didn't look like thugs. They looked like high-end security. The kind Julian hired when he wanted to intimidate uncooperative business rivals. One of them adjusted his earbud, his eyes locked on the heavy metal box I was clutching against my chest. I didn't wait to see if they had a warrant or a greeting. I ducked into a crowded pharmacy, heart racing, and slipped out through the delivery exit in the back. I spent the night in a motel that didn't ask for an ID, staring at the blueprints until the lines blurred. Julian wasn't just greedy. He was reckless. He had dumped 60% of the family's liquid assets into a luxury high-rise project called the Vance Heights. He thought he was building a monument to his own name. He didn't realize that the land, the very dirt those foundations were poured into, belonged to a shell company my mother had gifted to me on my 30th birthday. The sun rose on Monday morning like a warning flare. I dressed in the only professional outfit I had left, a sharp, charcoal gray blazer that made me feel like the conservator I was trained to be. I wasn't there to mourn anymore. I was there to perform an audit on a crumbling empire. When I walked into the mahogany row law offices of Sterling and Finch, the atmosphere was stifling. Julian was already there, sitting at the head of the massive conference table, flanked by 3 lawyers who looked like they cost more per hour than I made in a month. He didn't even look up when I entered. He was busy buffing his fingernails and checking his Rolex, the same one he'd worn while Mom was gasping for air in her hospital bed. "Ah, Cassandra," Julian said, finally looking up with a patronizing smirk. "Glad you could join us. I've asked the firm to speed this up. I have a flight to Vegas at 2, and I'd like to have the deed to the estate tucked into my briefcase before I board." The family attorney, Mr. Henderson, a man who had served my father for 40 years, looked pale. He kept glancing at me with a mixture of pity and something else. "Was it fear? Shall we begin?" Henderson whispered, his voice shaking as he opened a thick manila folder. "This is the last will and testament of Arthur Vance, dated 5 years ago." Julian leaned back, crossing his legs. "Skip the preamble, Henderson. We all know what it says. The son inherits the holdings, the daughter gets a generous relocation stipend and the sentimental jewelry. Let's sign the papers." Henderson cleared his throat. "Actually, Julian, there's a codicil, one added very recently. But before we get to that, I have to address the Vantage Point holdings." Julian's smirk faltered for a microsecond. "That's a private venture. It has nothing to do with the estate." "On the contrary," I said, speaking for the first time. My voice was calm, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "It has everything to do with the estate, considering you used Dad's emergency liquidity fund to break ground. A fund that, according to the original bylaws, requires 2 signatures for any withdrawal exceeding $1 million. Julian laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "And who was going to sign? Mom? She didn't know a hedge fund from a hedge maze. I had Dad's power of attorney. I am the law in this family, Cassie. Get used to it." "Actually," Henderson interrupted, his hand trembling as he pulled a second, thinner folder from his desk drawer. "Your father revoked that power of attorney 48 hours before his passing, and he didn't give it to you, Julian." The room went silent. The air felt heavy, like the moments before a lightning strike. Julian's face turned a mottled shade of purple. "What are you talking about? He was out of it. He didn't know what day it was." "He knew exactly what day it was," I said, sliding the flash drive across the table. "He knew it was the day he finally saw you for who you really are. He saw the bank transfers, Julian. He saw the way you treated Mom. And he decided that the Vance legacy shouldn't be a cage for his daughter, but a platform." Henderson opened the second folder. "This is the final notarized will of Arthur Vance. In it, he leaves the entirety of the Vance estate, including the family home, the offshore accounts, and all controlling shares of Vance Industries, to Cassandra." Julian bolted upright, his chair screeching against the floor. "That's a lie. It's a forgery. I'll sue you into the dirt. She manipulated him while he was dying." "I wasn't the one in Dubai while he was dying, Julian," I said, leaning forward. "I was the one holding the pen while he signed this. And wait, it gets better." I clicked a button on my laptop, and the blueprints for his Vance Heights project appeared on the wall-mounted monitor. "You spent $40 million of company money building on this lot," I pointed to the map. "But you forgot to check the land registry of the holding company that owns the soil. My mother bought this land 8 years ago. She put it in my name. Which means, Julian, you just built me a $40 million skyscraper, and I'm giving you 24 hours to vacate the premises." Julian's eyes went wide. He looked at his lawyers, but they were looking at the floor. The king was suddenly naked, and he was shivering. But then, Julian's expression shifted from shock to a terrifying, quiet rage. "You think you've won?" he hissed, leaning over the table until he was inches from my face. "You think some paper and a few videos change the way this world works? I still have the keys to the safe, Cassie. And I know something about Mom that you didn't see on that flash drive. Something that will make you wish you'd stayed on the sidewalk." Julian's breath smelled like expensive scotch and desperation. He was leaning so close I could see the tiny burst capillaries in his eyes. "You think Mom was a saint, Cassie? You think she did all this out of motherly love?" He let out a low, jagged chuckle that made the hair on my arm stand up. "Check the third folder on that drive, the one encrypted with Dad's birthday. Mom wasn't just protecting you. She was hiding from what you did 10 years ago. If the board sees that police report, your inheritance vanishes faster than a ghost." The room went ice cold. My heart skipped a beat, then slammed against my ribs. 10 years ago. The night of the accident. The night Julian told me he'd taken care of everything so I could finish my degree. I felt the blood drain from my face, and Julian saw it. He smirked, sensing the shift in power. He straightened his jacket, looking like the victor again. "I'll give you an hour to reconsider. You sign over the estate, and I'll keep that file buried. If not, you won't just be homeless, sister. You'll be in a cell." He turned on his heel and walked out of the conference room, his lawyers trailing behind like a pack of vultures. Mr. Henderson looked at me, his eyes full of worry. "Cassandra? Is there something I should know?" "Give me the room, Mr. Henderson," I whispered. As soon as the door clicked shut, I pulled out my laptop. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. My mother's voice echoed in my head. "The fox thinks he knows where the eggs are." I opened the encrypted folder. My heart was in my throat. I typed in the code. The file opened. It wasn't a police report. It wasn't a confession. It was a series of bank statements from 10 years ago, showing a massive payout from Julian's personal account to a private investigator and a witness. Below it was a recorded audio file. I pressed play. "Julian, she's traumatized," my mother's voice rang out. Younger, but just as sharp. "She thinks she hit that man. She thinks she's responsible. Why are you letting her believe that?" Then came Julian's voice, arrogant, cold, and calculating. "Because as long as she thinks she's a criminal, she'll never challenge me for the company. I fixed the car, Mom. I paid the victim to disappear. Cassie is under my thumb now. That's exactly where a daughter belongs." I sat there, frozen. For 10 years, I had carried a weight of guilt that had shaped every choice I made. I had lived in fear, thinking I was a monster, while Julian used my trauma as a leash. He hadn't protected me. He had framed me for an accident that never even happened. He had manufactured my greatest nightmare just to keep me from my birthright. A cold, hard rage settled into my bones. It wasn't the kind of rage that screams. It was the kind that builds a fortress. I looked at the blueprints on the screen. I looked at the land deeds. Julian thought he had a kill switch for my life, but he just handed me the evidence of his own extortion. I stood up, smoothed out my blazer, and walked out into the lobby. Julian was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city he thought he owned. He didn't even turn around. "Ready to sign, Cassie? Or should I call the precinct?" "I'm ready, Julian," I said, my voice echoing in the marble lobby. "But we're not signing over the house. We're going to talk about the 10 years of my life you stole with a lie. And we're going to talk about it in front of the board of directors, who are currently waiting for us in the next room." Julian froze. He turned around, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "What are you talking about? There is no board meeting." "I called them 10 minutes ago," I said, holding up my phone. "I told them I had evidence of a $40 million embezzlement and a decade-long extortion scheme involving the CEO. They're very interested in the Vance Heights project, Julian, especially the part where you built it on land you don't own." At that moment, the double doors to the main boardroom swung open. 6 of the most powerful people in the city walked out, led by the chairman of the board. They weren't looking at Julian with respect anymore. They were looking at him like a virus that needed to be eradicated. Julian's bravado vanished. He lunged for my laptop, his face contorted in a mask of fury. "You little—" But before he could touch me, the 2 men in suits, the ones I thought were following me to hurt me, stepped in front of him. One of them held up a badge. "Mr. Vance? We're with the Financial Crimes Division. We've been monitoring these accounts for months. We just needed the final authorization to move in." I watched as the handcuffs clicked shut around Julian's wrists. The Rolex he was so proud of was hidden by the steel of the cuffs. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic kind of hatred. "You'll have nothing. Without me, the company will fall. You're just a girl playing with blocks." "No, Julian," I said, stepping closer. "I'm a conservator. I know how to fix things that are broken from the inside out. And the first thing I'm fixing is the name Vance." As they led him away, the chairman of the board turned to me. "Ms. Vance, we have a lot to discuss. The project is in jeopardy, and the shareholders are panicked. What is your plan?" I looked out the window at the city. I thought about the house I'd been kicked out of. I thought about the lawn where my life had been tossed like trash. I felt a strange sense of peace. The revenge wasn't just in the winning. It was in the rebuilding. "My plan?" I said, a small smile playing on my lips. "My plan is to show you what happens when a daughter finally gets her inheritance." But as I walked toward the boardroom, Mr. Henderson caught my arm. He looked terrified. "Cassandra, wait. There's one more thing in the will. Something your father insisted on. A condition you haven't seen yet." My heart skipped a beat. "A condition?" I looked at Mr. Henderson, whose face was etched with a gravity that made the room feel smaller. "What kind of condition?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He opened the final page of the document, the one Julian hadn't even stayed to hear. "Your father knew that once Julian was out of the way, the wolves would circle. He knew the board would try to pressure you into selling the company for pennies on the dollar. The condition is this: to keep the inheritance, you must personally oversee the completion of Vance Heights within 12 months. If the project fails, the entire estate, the house, the accounts, everything, is liquidated and donated to a charitable trust." I looked at the board members. They were already whispering, looking at me like I was a temporary obstacle. They expected me to fail. They expected a girl playing with blocks to crumble under the weight of a $40 million construction nightmare. I looked back at Julian, who was being escorted toward the elevator in cuffs. He heard the condition and let out one last mocking laugh. 12 months? You couldn't even manage a kitchen remodel, Cassie. Enjoy the bankruptcy." The elevator doors closed on his face, and the lobby went silent. The chairman stepped forward. "Ms. Vance, let's be realistic. You're an architectural conservator. You work with old wood and stone. This is a high-tech glass and steel skyscraper with a massive budget deficit. Why don't you sign the rights over to us now? We'll give you a comfortable settlement, and you can go back to your quiet life." I looked at the blueprints on my screen. I saw the flaws in the foundation, the ones I'd spotted the night before. Julian had been cutting corners to save money for his Vegas trips. The building was literally leaning toward disaster. "I'm not signing anything," I said, my voice hardening. "I don't just work with old stone, Mr. Chairman. I specialize in finding the hidden cracks that make structures fail, and I've already found yours." The next 6 months were a blur of hard hats, steel-toed boots, and 4 non-AM site visits. I didn't just oversee the project, I lived it. I fired the corrupt contractors Julian had hired and brought in the best engineers in the country. I used the money Julian had hidden in offshore accounts, which my mother had carefully tracked, to fix the structural integrity of the building. I moved back into the family house the very next day. The first thing I did? I changed the locks. But I didn't stop there. I turned Julian's trophy room into a home office and donated his designer wardrobe to a local shelter. Every time I walked past the spot on the lawn where he'd thrown my belongings, I didn't feel pain. I felt power. The day of the grand opening arrived exactly 1 year later. Vance Heights didn't just open. It was the most successful commercial launch in the city's history. But it wasn't called Vance Heights anymore. Across the top of the glass facade, in bold, elegant letters, it read, "The Martha and Arthur Center," a place dedicated to supporting women-led startups and architectural preservation. As I stood on the penthouse balcony, looking out over the city, my phone buzzed. It was a collect call from a state penitentiary. I answered it. "Cassie?" Julian's voice was thin, stripped of all its arrogance. "I heard about the building. Look, I've been thinking. We're still family. My lawyers say I could get out early on good behavior if I had a job waiting for me. You owe me that much, right? For taking care of you all those years?" I looked at the horizon, where the sun was setting behind the building I had built with my own hands. "The only thing I owe you, Julian, is the truth," I said. "And the truth is, you were never the king. You were just the person holding the keys until the real owner showed up. Don't call me again." I hung up and felt the weight of 10 years finally lift off my shoulders. I wasn't the burden. I was the foundation. If you enjoyed this story of justice and rebuilding, make sure to hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to take back your life. For more incredible stories of standing your ground, subscribe to Silent Revenge Lab and turn on notifications. Remember, the best revenge isn't just winning, it's building something they can never touch. See you in the next one.